This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
Let's talk now about South Africa's democracy under pressure from things like unchecked corporate influence to political capture. The investigative non-profit organization called Open Secrets, they've launched a series of Who Owns South Africa? That's what the series is called, right? And part one has now already been made available. Part one has been labeled as The System, Money, Power and Politics. It reveals how private interests and elite networks shape public policy, often at the expense of accountability. From arms deals to financial secrecy, it traces the architecture of corruption across decades. And here now from Open Secrets is its head of investigations, Michael Merchant. Michael, very good morning and welcome to NRA on Radio 786.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it's such a massive task to undertake. Where did you start to even get going with part one?
It is an incredibly large task. And I think, as you've stressed in the introduction, this is the first of what will be a number of profiles. So we're certainly not saying that this first installment is the answer to all of the questions of who owns South Africa. And over the next couple of years, we'll be releasing regularly kind of smaller profiles that look at individual sectors of our economy and the concentration of ownership there. But in terms of where we started, what we wanted, as you've said, it's called the system. And what we wanted to look at is if you zoom out a little bit and you look at South Africa's economy through a kind of macro lens, what are the things that define it, especially from a private ownership perspective? And how has it or has it not changed since the end of apartheid and the beginning of democracy? And I think what, this first installment really goes to show is that the things that haven't changed is the concentration of power. And so, the apartheid system kind of inevitably created an economy where there was huge concentration of ownership. A very, very small minority of white South Africans owned large parts of the economy. And that, although it has shifted slightly, has not changed fundamentally. And certainly what hasn't changed either is the exclusion of the majority of South Africans from the economy. And, what we look at is how the economy continues to kind of stumble along, creating wealth for a small group of people. So if you look at the markets last week, the stock exchange at an all-time high, billionaires doing very well, and yet unemployment very high, growth very low. And I think that is really characterized. It characterizes the South African economy and the problems that we face as a society.
Okay, and ownership is a very strong word. Ownership means that, they get to have a say about what happens. And do you think that is what concentration of wealth accounts to, that it's about influence, it's about the ability to have a say, and sometimes that say, being so influential that it can have the net consequence of, formulation of policy, relationships within government, whether it is, the way in which, the market, is dictated and market forces develop themselves. Is that what this concentration of wealth amounts to when we try and understand this concept of owning something, and in this instance, owning South Africa?
Absolutely. I think that you've kind of hit the nail on the head there, which is that concentration of economic power, if you view it in terms of ownership. So if you look at some of, for example, South Africa's dollar billionaires, who are some of the wealthiest people in the country, if they own large parts of the economy, it gives them power in two different ways. So it gives them direct economic power. So I think if you are a large player at one of the largest corporations, you are able to direct the patterns of investment. For example, you decide which firms continue to operate and which don't. You decide how firms engage in job creation, etc. So you have a great deal of power on that front. But I think what your question is also going to, which is something we speak about a lot, is that how does that translate into political power and the ability to shape policy and shape narratives and shape the way that the state addresses the private sector? And it does it in a few different ways. The kind of obvious one is through political party funding. So we speak about in this profile the fact that if you look at the biggest donors to political parties since the transparency requirements for political party funding were introduced, they're almost all the billionaires. So it is the Oppenheimer family, it's Michiel Leroux, Martin Marshall, Patrice Motsepe's group of companies. And so they don't fund single individual parties, but they fund a range of parties, and that gives them a great degree of influence. We also know that corporations, especially the large corporations, are able to engage in extensive corporate lobbying of our governments, and they do so largely behind closed doors. So we don't have a lot of transparency around this, but what we do know is that at very high levels, there are secret meetings that take place between organized business and some of our largest corporations, specifically on issues of policy to get their views. And then, last but not least, we speak about this idea about the revolving door. And I think particularly in the financial sector, which has become so dominant in South Africa's economy today, that has really kind of shifted over the last 30 years, the rise of finance, banks and asset managers, is this kind of constant pattern or revolving door of senior executives moving between private institutions in the financial sector and regulators and vice versa. So, for example, the Reserve Bank, Treasury, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority. And that movement, I think, inevitably leads to regulators essentially starting to take on the interests of the private sector that they regulate.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for me also, the big concern that there used to be, ICASA senior officials that, end up on the boards of these telecommunication companies, the very companies that they were meant to regulate. And I'm not suggesting that there's anything unlawful that they may or may not have done, but there seems to be, a questionable, symbiotic relationship there between the regulators and those in big corporate bodies. How do we then understand the concentration of this wealth? And look, I mean, on the one end, there is this, very ugly experience of apartheid that we had, which did skew the ownership not just of wealth, but wealth concentrated in land, to a white minority. And that is a legacy which I'm not certain we've done the best at trying to undo. So there's that particular element. And then there's also, a free market that has exploded since 1994, to which, we've seen the likes of, those, yes, in traditional sectors like mining, for instance, they've done pretty well with markets opening, but also how we've seen the likes of Remgro and others, for instance, growing in the delivery of healthcare, in the delivery of banking, etc. That almost every facet of society that they've seen an opportunity, and they've gotten rich along the way, much richer than what they had originally been. And is that as a consequence of, just pure open market policy, or do you believe that in some way or the other that open market policy is engineered in some way to make the rich a lot more richer?
I think it completely is. And I think that you've just laid out there one of the core arguments that we make in this paper, which is that if you look at the way that wealth and power was concentrated at the end of apartheid, the thing that was really going to entrench that and make it incredibly difficult to challenge was this kind of widespread opening up of markets. So liberalizing financial flows and allowing the wealthiest corporations to delist from South Africa and move their resources, for example, to the UK. The privatization and corporatization of so many of our sectors. For example, you've mentioned private healthcare, which is going to be the next profile in this series. And we look very much at how individuals, like Remgro have extensive interests in the private sector. And I think that, the argument there is that what the complete liberalization of financial flows and neoliberal economic policies in general, what they do is that they ensure that those at the top of the pyramid can essentially exponentially increase their wealth. So if you look at the top 6 wealthiest South Africans at the moment, they have nearly 600 billion rand in net wealth, and that grows exponentially because of the financialization of our economy. And as you've said, when you have interests across every single sector and those privatized services, you get essentially more and more of that. And what it's meant is that as the state has kind of retreated and left it to the private sector, this notion that private sector investments, etc., will help us, the reality is that the economy is showing something very different, which is that economic decisions by the powerful are made increasingly with the purpose of extraction in mind. It is much more short-term, it's much more extractive. More and more money goes to dividends, it goes to shareholders and paying debt, and less money goes into investment, into productive job-creating investment. And, for those, for example, who live in Cape Town will know that the textile manufacturing sector has lost essentially 90% of its jobs during South Africa's democracy, partly because of the government's insistence on neoliberal policies, cutting tariffs, not offering protection. But those were job-creating and job-sustaining industries, and we have fundamentally lost those over the course of our democratic period.
We are talking to Michael Merchant. He is the head of investigations at Open Secrets. They do excellent work in a lot of stories that most media aren't able to trace and follow. It's, their sort of poised work that, requires delicate investigation. And so they've launched a new series called Who Owns South Africa? And part 1 has just released. It's called The System, Money, Power and Politics. It reveals just how private interests and elite networks shape policy, and often at the expense of accountability. How much of our political processes and institutions that make up a democratic society do you believe is either compromised or hijacked by this, corporate interests? In America, of course, you have a system that is quite in your face. It's quite, there's sponsors, there are people that buy ads, there's investments into these candidates, etc. You have, of course, at the moment, a lot of question marks about AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, and why they seem to have such a control over Congress and senators, etc. Ours don't seem to appear to be as vivid as that. We had, of course, the episode of state capture that, for me seemed, yes, it was indeed, a case of, private interest and public interest and the lines being blurred there, and those lines often being blurred by corruption. But sometimes, that was also packaged in a way that there was a lot of noise because politically it was then relevant to make a noise about that. But, with a different political dispensation, I suppose, or a different political leader, you still have bits of this, that, and the other, but sometimes packaged very, very differently. And look, I mean, one can look at this not just through the South African lens. There are very many other examples around the world. I look at what's happening in Indonesia at the moment, and the way in which Indonesians are rising up against the perks that government officials have, and so on and so forth. The question, I suppose, this in a very long-winded way, is what I'm trying to understand is the layers, the veils that exist in how we understand corporate influence in our body politics.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question as well, because I don't think that we would argue that it's one for one, in the sense that to say there's extensive corporate power and then to say that in every single instance the state follows the interests of corporations, because I think we live in a very interesting politics and society where sometimes those interests clash. And I think if we think about some contemporary, very notable examples, the fact that the private sector and the state have essentially gone to war about national health insurance, which fundamentally goes to this question about the extent of private versus public interests. And so it's not always the case that the lobbying and the funding inevitably leads to a confluence of interests in every particular case. But I think there's maybe two things to stress. The one is that in terms of, you're speaking about, for example, the funding of politics, we've only really had a window into that for a few years because transparency in political party funding is so new. And it's still very incomplete. So a lot of our large parties don't regularly disclose their funders, which makes it sometimes difficult to work out. If we think about Mkhonto Sizwe, for example, the official opposition, I think they've only made one disclosure since they've existed. And so we are not fully aware of the money that goes into those parties. Some of the larger parties, such as the ANC, the DA, and the IFP, make more regular disclosures. And they make very clear that it is usually the exceedingly wealthy that are providing money to those parties in a bid to make influence. But I think there's maybe a slightly more important and interesting thing to consider here, which is that is there a long-term interest in undermining the capacity of the state to act as a proper regulator and guide of state policy? And I think that goes along very much with neoliberal and kind of corporate ideology. And it's something that we see in South Africa, this, for example, insistence that on austerity policies, that we must increasingly cut funding to key institutions. And what that means is that over time, the state's capacity and resources to take on the work it needs to, all the way from law enforcement through to regulatory bodies, is compromised. And if you look, you made the comparison with the Trump administration, and there's obviously lots that isn't similar. But one of the things that is similar is that Trump and his regime has very deliberately set out to gut the regulatory capacity of the state, firing people, decapacitating institutions that hold corporations to account, with the idea that this kind of unfettered pursuit of profit by private institutions is good for the country. Now, we're certainly not there at that extent in South Africa. There's still pushback. But it's going to be very vital, I think, if you want to start looking forward, to avoid the continued kind of erosion of state capacity to benefit the private sector.
Yeah, which is certainly, I think, a pattern that is on display at the moment in differing examples that we can definitely highlight. I want to come back to the recurring theme of the arms deal. It's like the headache that refuses to go away, possibly because we've never really had any settlement on this issue about the extent to which Thales, Jacob Zuma, Shabir Sheikh, Trevor Manuel, Alec Irwin, all of these guys, they've not really accounted for what went wrong there. And even though those are monies that were spent, I'm not sure whether we're still paying on it. I suppose we're paying the price of a poor investment, definitely. But what is your assessment about why the arms deal is still a relevant and a necessary subject to understand how at the onset we've seen this very problematic relationship between big capital and politics?
Yes, I think that we've always made the argument that the arms deal was really a manifestation of apartheid era corporate networks coming into the democratic era. And so to understand it was important because it was to understand the consequences really of impunity and the fact that in the late apartheid period, by failing to tackle the networks of private and corporate interests that profited from the system, you almost guaranteed that they would reform in a new political era to take advantage and to continue to profit. And of course, as you said, the other reason it's so relevant to continue discussing it is that it's still before our courts. So Thales and the former President Zuma, they are, this very year in court in KwaZulu-Natal, and that long-awaited trial is supposed to begin. So I think it's very important. But I think this question about, the consequences of impunity, the other reason that it has a kind of broader relevance is that we are now in many ways grappling with it again. And we speak about this in the first chapter of Her in South Africa, this question that we haven't really held anyone to account for state capture either. And suddenly what we're starting to see, just like we saw those years ago with the arms deal, is we're starting to see those who were most centrally involved in state capture beginning to rehabilitate themselves, to hold very senior political positions, to hold very senior corporate positions, and almost seek to pretend as if none of this happened. And so the arms deal will always, I think, represent for us a kind of inevitable consequence of impunity, and it shines a light on what happens when you don't pursue accountability properly. And it should be a stark warning for us today as we continue, to face those for more contemporary crimes and really still to be struggling with problems of impunity.
Yeah, and talking about getting away with impunity, one would assume that there ought to be mechanisms in place, be it through Parliament, where parliamentarians that are elected to serve there can play a very meaningful role in holding to account, errant issues in society or even members of society, particularly when the public is at risk. That is, one very powerful mechanism that often hasn't fully been realized, and we saw the lapses with the whole state capture drama that we've had. Let's see how they're going to handle this General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi matter. That also off to a bit of a rocky start, but nonetheless, I digress. What I want to get at is beyond Parliament and the judicial system, which of course is in some cases the final arbiter when and if an issue finally reaches there. You also have along the way, this lifting of the corporate veil of secrecy, this corporate culture that you have in which auditing firms and financial institutions play quite a meaningful role in either enabling or curtailing corruption, and holding to account not just on the main, whether you are money laundering or whether you are hiding funds or whether you've misreported things, but also on commitments, to a broader social responsibility. And so even there, one would have thought, and we had the Bain example and others, and McKinsey and so on, but what we learn from those examples is that even at auditing firms level, that there is some serious work there that needs to be done, because we cannot continue to have more standoffs, and breed that sort of corporate corruption that we see on display. So what role really do these auditing firms play in moving the needle on trying to, really get to the sort of work that you guys are up to, to reveal exactly the extent to which sometimes you have very dodgy behavior amongst corporates?
Yeah, just briefly before we talk about the regulators, the one other thing I'd say, the first part of your question, which is that we often do see Parliament as this kind of institution of last resort, that Parliament holds inquiries when things have gone terribly, terribly wrong. You think about Steinhoff as a good example, the Thabo Bester prison break, that suddenly Parliament springs into action. We should be expecting a lot more of parliamentarians, because they should be much more proactive and they should be doing much more ongoing engagement and monitoring and accountability. And we know from the state capture years that Parliament fundamentally failed to do that. And so, as it changes, and certainly as our politics changes, it's going to be crucial to kind of rebuild Parliament's capacity to act as that kind of oversight institution for our politics. But to turn to your second question, I think what we have long seen in the work at Open Secrets is that the kind of regular audit failures that you speak about, the failures of large private sector audit firms, those are not individual cases of failure. I think they represent a systemic problem with the idea that private financial actors who are working with each other all the time and who benefit from working together, the idea that they are going to either hold themselves or each other to account, I think is deeply problematic. And so, we've long argued that there's kind of two central ways of dealing with this. The one is that there should be reform of audit firms. There should be a much clearer divide between their consulting and other services from their audit bodies. That's the one. And the other one, and this is where we have seen some progress in South Africa, and it's been encouraging to see in the audit area because we haven't seen it elsewhere, is that the regulator, the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors, has stepped up regulation for it to be more stringent and more active. And so we've seen an increase in the fines that are available for errant auditors and when auditors engage in misconduct. That was something that Open Secrets argued for when the law was introduced. And we've also seen the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors actually holding much more regular hearings into audit misconduct and actually making findings regarding when auditors are engaged in misconduct. And that is unfortunately in the private sector fairly rare. And we don't see the same level of activity, for example, in the legal profession, by the accounting bodies, by the banking regulator. And that's, I think, what should be of concern. We should really be building the capacity and the resources of all of these regulatory bodies to hold these actors to account.
Yeah. Okay. Lots of ground, I suppose, to cover in this very fascinating series of body of work that's being done. What can we expect in future editions?
So coming up in the future really is more deep dives into individual sectors of the economy. So, this is quite a zoomed out kind of macro lens of our economy. So coming up next is going to be the private healthcare system. We're going to be asking who owns our medical aids and our private hospitals. And then after that, we're going to be looking at media, telephony, the banking sector, and so, regularly kind of publishing those. And would really encourage everyone, if you are interested in this series, to sign up for the Open Secrets newsletter. All of the reports are freely available on our website, opensecrets.org.za.
You guys do great work. I hope you keep up with it, and looking forward to the future editions of this very expansive investigation into who owns South Africa. Thank you very much. Michael Merchant, he is from Open Secrets, the head of investigations.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.